Look at that.
Yeah, how to turn up.
You're talking to me. So, you're right now. It's good to do that. My dad recommended chiller out. It's just yes, she's definitely pretend. And she's the only one. The other churches look good. This happens every few years, right? Like every few years, something's in a street. So this is the first time we had this problem. But it's not. And I know it's not. Yeah, I know it's not because you've never made it. But now he comes out, so he'll come out and push them with and so we're making progress. Yeah, yeah,
But,
that's, he's showing like,
yeah.
I like bitch chocolate. I like bitch chocolate chip ice cream. I like bitch chocolate chip ice cream. Merry Christmas.
I'm seeing.
a mask is bigger. That cat, that dog.
Belgian Malin.
Belgian Alma. So you can get your pouch. So these were the first two.
Oh,
The first
so
3
it's
months.
gonna change.
We didn't even do the DNA test until she was about 4 months old. And we were like, what?
Maybe the kid.
Yeah, she was sick. Super. Did you guys
guys not get the eye practice?
My daughter's.
Are we good?
Yeah, yeah.
Good evening, folks. Thank you all for making it out on a very busy Friday here in Alma. There's a lot going on, and it's a big weekend for all of us. Certainly celebration we have, but most importantly for today, it is the recognition of Armistice Day and Veterans Day. And we have had a tradition here the past few years of bringing in speakers to challenge us, to help us think about Veterans Day appropriately, and for all of us as students, staff, faculty, and community members, bond together over this shared recognition. I am personally very excited about our speaker today because we have been friends for nearly 20 years. Reverend Dr. Adam Teege is also currently he's an active duty chaplain, but he served for 9 years in active duty, then went to the reserves and has been recently brought back teaching in the War College, or working in the War College. Adam is working on his THD at Duke Divinity School and has written, you can look up his book there, has written experiences, especially as it relates to his academic studies. And I am personally just very thankful for not just his service, but for Adam as a minister, as an educator, and certainly as a friend to so many of us. It's a little different than introducing someone I don't know that well. I was going to tell stories about him and point out all the ways that he has grown up from when we were young undergrads out there. But he has been someone from the first day of meeting Adam in Princeton Theological Seminary, is someone who absolutely shines by asking questions that are challenging, thinking about things at a deeper level. And that type of conversation we have here at Alma College is ideal. Not just the surface level, what does it mean to remember, but why are we remembering and what do we do with that? I'm delighted to welcome Adam here to Alma College, and I would invite you all to do the same by giving him a very warm round of applause. Adam?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So Andrew, again, likewise, since first meeting you at seminary, just been a great friend. You made the experience of life there bearable and possible, and introduced me to all sorts of fun things like drinking and poker, so it made it all the better. And so it's a pleasure to be here. I got to see the campus quite a bit today, got to meet a lot of people, students, faculty, the football team out at the cemetery to honor and remember some veterans at the Memorial Cemetery out there. And so it's good to be with you here tonight. In some sense, I feel quite underqualified. I guess you could say I'm a veteran. I've certainly served in the Army, went to Afghanistan, come home, experienced significant combat and the like, but in the role of a chaplain, right? And so I'm a non-combatant, and so I care for soldiers and bear witness to their lives before, during, and after war and the experiences they go through. So in that sense, I can speak to you as someone who has walked with them and borne witness to what they've gone through. And that's kind of what I bring to bear today. And so I told the football team a little bit about my grandfather and his experience as a World War II veteran. And so I would just say that for me, the highest honor and privilege of my life was serving with the soldiers of 1st through 20th, a unit in the 101st, being with them in Afghanistan, coming home with them from Afghanistan. But those were difficult years, and they suffered significantly, not just from the physical trauma of war, getting blown up, being killed, and wounded in ways that they'll live with forever. But on the other side, coming home, I had 5 soldiers who died at their own hands after we returned. And so ongoing wounds, several more, I've since come to find out, tragically, several more died by suicide in the years since. And so all that to say that war leaves indelible marks, indelible wounds, not just physically, but on the soul, and not just psychologically, but what you might call a kind of moral wounds of the experiences of what they've seen and done. And so I want to share a little bit about St. Martin today. I think it's related, but that's kind of the backdrop for me when I come to this. So I hope you'll hear it in that, with that in mind. And so, St. Martin. One of the more interesting kind of cultural shocks, so it's a real cultural shift, right, to enter the military. It's got its own sort of unique culture. So when I first arrived on active duty, right, so I'm a pastor, I've been in a church as a pastor, United Church of Christ, was to find the cult of the saints show up in kind of a civil religious practice among soldiers, right? So saints like St. Martin. So I began active duty, as I said, with the 101st Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And we had a patron saint, St. Michael, right? So St. Michael, the archangel, patron saint for soldiers, kind of broadly, generally, but then for the airborne community specifically, right? Angel has wings, right? So it must be airborne. And so within days of arriving into the unit as the chaplain, completely green, I had soldiers asking me for these medallions, right? Like, what? Okay, yeah. So, like, okay, are you Catholic, right? Like, I just what I assumed, right, that they would ask for a saint medallion because they're Catholic, but some were, but not all, and many not even Christian, right? Just soldiers looking for something, and so. I don't know if it was just a kind of a vestigial curiosity with religion or kind of superstitious kitsch. But we're going to war. And so my sense was they were wanting to take whatever we've got, right? And if it's the St. Michael medallion, then they'll take it, right? But very clearly something going on there with, on the one side, right, the image of St. Martin, or excuse me, St. Michael. We'll get to St. Martin. St. Michael, and on the other side, the unit crest or symbol, right? And so kind of leaving little room for any subtlety about like the presence of God with us, right? There's a real kind of tight relationship that was intended there as we headed out to Afghanistan. And then, of course, for some of the Catholic soldiers, right? These were very deep points of connection to their rich life of faith. So this cult of saints within the military was new to me, and so it was that I came to be familiar with St. Martin. So today is November the 11th, Veterans Day. As we all know, American national holiday, coming out of Armistice Day, broadening out after World War II and Korea to be inclusive of all veterans, right? But before it was Armistice Day, it was and remains the feast day for St. Martin. So today is the saint day for St. Martin. And so it's actually no accident that these things coincide. St. Martin, a patron saint of soldiers, and Armistice Day, the end of World War I. Very much in mind when the end of hostilities were declared on at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month, because this is when the feast of St. Martin was celebrated, St. Martin Mass or St. Martin's Tag in France, England, Holland, Germany, right? And so like the culture, kind of culturally like our Thanksgiving, but then religiously tied to this patron saint, a day to cease hostilities and to celebrate. And so with that in view, I thought it might be interesting, maybe not, helpful, maybe not, to introduce or reintroduce us on this day to St. Martin, to share a little bit about his life, about his legacy, and the way that I've seen that it's shaped military chaplaincy. But ultimately, I'd like to offer some suggestions around how St. Martin presents for us a challenge for the church, for us around going to war, who goes to war, that and what that experience is like, and the care of those who come home. So who is St. Martin? So I want to start by sharing what I call the status quo story about who St. Martin is. This is kind of the story that I was told as a chaplain. Not all at once, but in bits and pieces. I pieced together this status quo story about who St. Martin is and why he was important, why, me as a Protestant coming into this culture came to know I had a patron saint and to appreciate who he was. And so St. Martin was a Roman soldier born in Hungary in 316, born into a pagan military family. And we should not be surprised that as the son of a soldier, he's named after the god of war, Mars, right? So Martin, Mars. And though born into this pagan military family, at some point, Martin becomes a catechumen. He's going through the process of catechesis to become baptized, to become a member of the church. And so it's his intent to ultimately live a monastic life. But before he's able to do that, before he's able to be baptized, he's conscripted. There's an imperial edict, a need to raise an army, and because of his station in society as the son of a soldier, he's brought in. And so, by all accounts, the stories of his life, he is humble and modest as a soldier, well liked by his peers, well regarded by his superiors, and so as this status quo story goes, he in the winter he's entering a city. You may know this story if you know St. Martin. He's entering a city, and at the gates, at the entry, he sees a man, a beggar, and he's crying out in need, and this man is being ignored by all who pass him. And St. Martin, as the story goes, sees the man, takes off his cape, cuts it with his sword, and gives him half of his cloak. And so there was, mixed response among the crowd. Some were laughing. The implication is that this is the clothes that he has, and he's naked in this process. But others, were ashamed, right? Because they had ignored this man and realized their own sense of judgment at not responding. And so that night, St. Martin has a dream of Christ himself clothed in that half of his cloak that he had given to the poor man. And so in this dream, Martin overhears Jesus exclaim to the angels that Martin, who is still but a catechumen, clothed me with this robe. Martin clothed me with this robe. And so that it's this absolutely transformative experience for Martin. And after serving in the military, he does eventually find his way, is baptized, enters into monastic life, and founds many monastic communities himself. Lives in poverty and simplicity, becomes well-loved and honored. He's elevated against his own protests to become a bishop of the city that he lives in, Tours in France, and serves there until his death toward the end of the 4th century. And so very quickly, he's well loved and becomes this popular saint, one of the most popular in the Western Church. And so this soldier turned monastic, turned bishop, is one of the first non-martyrs to become venerated as a saint. And so as part of this veneration, and for some reasons we'll get into, it becomes standard practice that Martin's cape, from the story with the beggar, the half I presume that he kept, is taken into battle by the French kings, flown as a banner. And the priest who marches with the reliquary that houses this relic, this cape, becomes known as the Capelanu, and eventually over time the priests in general who are serving with the military come to be known as capellani, or in French, chapelain. And so here we have the etymological origins of the word chaplain. And so this is, in brief, the status quo story, right? The status quo story that is usually concerned with capturing these several key details, right? That, as I said, that St. Martin is sort of historically and etymologically linked to the emergence of Christian clergy as military chaplains. Or second, that a fact for service members and chaplains that further establishes his authority. Excuse me. Beyond his saintly bona fides is that St. Martin is a soldier himself, very important to this status quo story. I've highlighted it, but it's usually passed over that he's a conscript. And third, in the foregrounding in the telling, even as a soldier, is the importance of St. Martin as a pastoral figure, right? This scene at the gates with the beggar is very important. Martin is embodying these practices of care that are centrally tied to images of chaplaincy and care. And this story is kind of the primary canonical example of what compassion and care as a chaplain can and should be. And so taken all together, this story functions to kind of undergird the legitimacy of military chaplaincy. This is what it looks like, and this is where it comes from, and this is what it should be. And so, of course, it's no surprise then that St. Martin is the patron saint of the chaplain corps. The highest award within the chaplain corps is being inducted into the Order of St. Martin. And so this story provides a kind of historical anchor, an animating myth that helps to kind of define and undergird military chaplaincy. Sorry, my throat is very, excuse me. So the goodness of military service is not a given in every corner of the church, right? Across the church, there's a multiplicity of views on this. The goodness of clergy in uniform, also not a given. And there's, sacred and secular, thank you, counter narratives that raise important questions about this the status quo story that I've told. And so what I find most interesting and what I want to share now is I think that a lot of these counter pressures bubble up from the life of St. Martin himself, right? So this is a story only partly told. And so what does this story leave out about St. Martin? Oh dear. It's my Ted Cruz moment here. Sorry. All right, so the status quo story, I think, neglects to inform us that St. Martin was very much intent on leaving military service. And so as the rest of the story goes, on the eve of a campaign in Germany, the Emperor Julian is out, amongst his troops and trooping the line, as they say, and he's there to pay them, right? To give them their what's called a donative, right? Their pay before going into battle to cement their loyalty, right? You don't want to have troops that are questioning whether they're going to be compensated or something as they head into battle, and to lift their morale before they go out. And so, I'm just imagining they're in line, right? Next, whatever, to get their pay. And so it's Martin's turn, and he's there before the emperor, right? In this story from his life, he's there before the Emperor Julian. And so this is what Martin says to the Roman emperor. He says, "Hitherto I have served you as a soldier. Allow me now to become a soldier to God. Let the man who is to serve you receive your pay. I am the soldier of Christ. It is not lawful for me to fight." So, bold move. The emperor, of course, doesn't take this well, right? It's very public, and he's accused of cowardice. He's thrown in prison, beaten, right? But before all that, upon being charged with cowardice and whatnot, Martin tells the emperor, "No, it's not because I'm afraid. In fact, tomorrow I'll go with you in battle at the front, unarmed. It's not about that." But he's imprisoned, and the next day, these Germanic barbarians that they're to go to battle with, they beg for peace, and so the battle never happens. And Martin's eventually released from prison, and then ultimately from military service in the Roman Legion. Find it interesting in Luke chapter 3, in the Gospel, John the Baptist, you may be familiar with the story, standing on the Jordan River, calling people to repentance, and there's soldiers there at this scene. And so the soldiers ask, "Well, what about us? What are we to do? We're soldiers, Roman soldiers. What do we need to do?" And so John the Baptist in this, famous story says, "Don't extort money from anyone by threats or accusations. Be satisfied with your wages. Be satisfied with your wages." My goodness, St. Martin, be satisfied with your wages. So it's this often used text to justify military service, right? It's all teed up for John the Baptist here. Soldiers are asking. He could have said, "Nope, not a vocation Christians can go into," but he doesn't, right? And so it's seen as this affirmation of Christian soldiering. And yet Martin in this scene refuses his pay and very directly sets up Christian service in opposition to his service to the empire. And so, what are we to make of this? Well, certainly the use of St. Martin's relics later in battle, right? This cape going into battle is at the very least highly ironic in light of the scene. This soldier of Christ, even in death, is conscripted back into the service of Caesar, or the French kings anyway. And so we have to wonder then, in this scene, is this Martin's prophetic no? Is this Martin embodying a form of Christian witness that moves beyond sort of this preparatory repentance of John the Baptist, pointing us to Christ crucified as a judgment on any and all war making? A kind of, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," a prophetic no? A rejection of Christian service in war? Maybe. So St. Martin entered military service only a couple decades after Constantine ended the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. And so until Constantine, Christians typically, as a part of their catechesis process, would have had to leave military service before being baptized. And so up until Constantine, the early church is the church of the martyrs. The cloud of witnesses includes many military martyrs. There's soldiers who, in lots of stories, it's a common kind of story or trope or theme of accounts of military martyrs that are rather similar to Martin's story here. His story is kind of echoing these earlier accounts of military martyrs coming before the emperor with similar kinds of exclamations. Except in this account, the emperor before whom he comes is nominally Christian, not yet the apostate. And St. Martin, unlike those martyrs, right, he's imprisoned, mocked, beaten, but he gets out, right? He's not martyred. He goes on to live for decades, eventually becomes the bishop. And so for his earlier biographers, his military service is a bit of an embarrassment. And even the dates of his birth are thrown into question around when is he baptized, when is he born, because they're trying to figure out a way to kind of excuse his military service. And even toward the end of his life in the accounts, there's a story of a fellow monk who taunts him that he was defiled by his military service. And Martin in these stories, he doesn't deny it. So I think there's something here to be made of this binary opposition that we could set up around the life of St. Martin. We could ask, is St. Martin a late witness for the pacifism of the early church? Or is St. Martin an early witness for the emerging just war tradition? I think which St. Martin shows up depends on who's telling the story. We have the pastoral soldier who cares for the beggar with his sword, right? And another story, he's the bishop who augurs military victory for another emperor, Maximus. He's a saint, right? Who through his relics continues to offer God's blessing in battle. Or like with this story, is he a prophet renouncing war to pursue a monastic vocation? And so it's this kind of binary that seems to be at stake in both the way his biographers tell his story and in this ongoing legacy of his relics. What's most interesting to me is what remains unmentioned and a very real mystery, which is whether St. Martin himself ever served in combat. So the historian Claire Stancliffe, who suggests that it's not only possible, but perhaps even likely that he did. In Stancliffe's work, suggests that there's a battle that occurs right before, in this same campaign, right before this event with the emperor, where St. Martin is renouncing his service. And so if that's true, if St. Martin served in combat, if the sword by which he so compassionately shared with the beggar was stained with blood, I think St. Martin's renunciation before the emperor sounds rather different. I don't think it can be as easily reduced, or not only reduced, to this prophetic no of a man intervening in geopolitics, or at least it can't only be that. But I think it may be something much darker and sadder. Perhaps this is the public confession of a man who, on his way to the monastery to serve Christ, is caught up in war and finds himself far afield from the path that he had been set upon from his youth. Hitherto I have served you as a soldier. Allow me now. Allow me now. You can almost hear like the desperation. Allow me now to become a soldier of Christ. And so St. Martin can't even accept his pay, perhaps fearing that it too is maybe stained with blood. And so I guess I wonder, might it be that like his cloak, St. Martin himself has been cut open by war? I think in light of Stancliffe's work, we can at least ask the question. Is St. Martin's refusal that of this pre-Constantinian Christian renouncing bloodshed and war, or the cry of a Christian in service of a nominally Christian emperor and empire who had already shed blood? And I think with this in view, I would suggest that St. Martin, I think, helpfully embodies for us what are often abstract debates in this kind of post-Constantinian church about war and military service, how these questions emerge from the lives of soldiers themselves, and very painfully so. He exemplifies the moral contradictions at stake in these wider debates. Hitherto I have served you as a soldier, right? He served as a soldier. It is not lawful for me to fight. He's holding these things together, and with this imperative of those potential wounds. Allow me now. Allow me now. So while questions abound regarding Martin's life, what is certain is that upon his death, Martin's body immediately becomes venerated as a relic of great importance. Again, he's beloved in his life, just a saint of a man. His body, as early as 507, comes to serve as an oracle for kings going into battle, echoing this earlier scene where he's served as an augur for Maximus and his victory in battle. And he becomes this vital symbol and of the defense of the city of Tours. His presence, his relics are important for the defense of this city. And so from there, it's easy to see how along the way it becomes practice for his cape to be taken by the French kings into battle. Again, this conscript, once again, taken out onto the battlefield. And so this is the image for me that I'd like to highlight for us today, that I think very forcefully unites the kind of shared predicament of soldiers and their chaplains. And I know this may sound a little controversial in our all-volunteer army of today, but conscription. And so I don't mean this in the narrow technical sense of compulsory enlistment, but of course, as recently as Vietnam and I think 1972, we had compulsory enlistment. Although I think that applies underneath what I'm talking about. But I take it to apply to the multiplicity of ways in which the agency of soldiers and then even chaplains like myself is constrained and pressed into the service of people, of ideas, of stories, nations, in ways that may not align with their own intentions and desires and the stories that they would seek to tell about themselves. I'm so sorry to do that, but I think it'll keep me from coughing. St. Martin is known as a patron of soldiers. And on the surface, from looking down, top down, it might better be said that he's the patron saint of kings, right? As he's going into battle as this symbol of military success. he's also the patron saint of the nation of France, and so he is that too. But within the just war tradition, it's possible to see how St. Martin, in this kind of medieval advancement of Christianity, is a figure then for this faithful Christian soldier, loving God and neighbor. As I mentioned earlier, his sword used for care, right? He's drawing near to his neighbor in this story with the beggar at the gate through his very instrument of violence. And this is the just war story, that swords can be wielded for the love of neighbor, even on the battlefield, even of enemies as neighbors. The challenge, I think, is that St. Martin's refusal before the emperor challenges that story, not just because it stands in the just war story stands in contradiction to the witness of the early church, but also it suggests that if even St. Martin could not see his way toward faithfully loving his neighbor on the battlefield, then who among us can? Of course, in the just war story, soldiers don't send themselves, right? They're sent by rulers with legitimate authority. Conscripts or not, soldiers don't pick their battles. I'll always remember the mantra of the first unit that I arrived to there in the 101st. I am a strike soldier. I fight where I'm told and I win where I fight. Soldiers are pressed to fight and to kill, regardless of their own moral judgments about said fighting and killing. Of course, this is not to say that the battlefield is bereft of love. Love abounds among soldiers. I witnessed it myself. As they care for one another, even die for one another. But I think it persists on the battlefield, not because it's necessarily called forth by the cause itself, but in spite of the many contradictions of being formed and sent to kill and die for love. And I think ultimately, this concept of conscription means that even love itself becomes taken up and pressed into service for war, as soldiers' love for one another, soldiers' love for those at home, their neighbors and families, and even their love for God is put in service to war. Patron saint of soldiers, but also the patron saint of chaplains. And I think this is quite a similar situation, as chaplains too, seeking to love God and neighbor in the midst of war. And for chaplains, their near neighbors are the soldiers with whom they are encamped, right? And I think that the life and legacy of St. Martin, particularly around his relics, right, and the service of chaplains as the caretakers of these sacred relics, suggests that chaplains too endure a similar kind of conscription of their care even. It seems quite fitting that it was the cape of all things, right, that the French took into battle. This great symbol of Martin's love and care for his neighbor, this encounter with Christ himself, is taken up into battle. And so military chaplains have taken on this story and this symbol as central to their vocation, to care for soldiers in the midst of battle. But to whose or to what end? No doubt chaplains through the centuries afforded soldiers access to the sacraments, to pastors, to pastoral care, to God, but always in the shadow of these relics. And like the relics, they too have been put into the service of the king. And so I think that St. Martin's status as a patron is even more fitting than those of us who tell the status quo story may realize. So I just want to make a few concluding comments and then love to hear what you all think. So I think what we can learn from St. Martin is that the church and the gospel, the good news that the church bears, are always in danger of being conscripted, of being put to work in the service of the state, especially in the context of war, and that this is not an abstract danger, but is as real as whatever that threat in war would be to our would-be enemies, as it is to the bodies and souls of our soldiers, those who we would send to fight and to kill and to die, who we have sent to fight and to kill and to die, those who we remember today, our veterans. The powers of this world, I think, are all too willing to tap into the power of the sacred, of the divine, to march with it into battle, both proverbially and very quite literally. What I hope is that St. Martin's life offers us an image that shows us that while the gospel can be conscripted and taken into battle, it cannot be contained. The power of the gospel eludes foreclosure and emerges with the power for reversal and refusal, as we see in that story of St. Martin before the emperor, with the possibilities for overcoming evil with good. In this examination of St. Martin's life, I've pressed against what I think are some dangers and limits of just war. I think there's some very real questions and problems to address within that tradition. But I would say that my intentions aren't as intended as a whole. I'm not intending a wholesale rejection of the just war tradition. I think there's actually two legitimate streams of Christian thinking on war, pacifism and just war. But that if just war is to be of use, then I think the church, that God's people, individual soldiers who are Christians, need to be able to act and speak with faith and be prepared at times, like St. Martin, to be able to stand before the emperor and to say no. That the church needs to form its young people to be able to do that, to send pastors into the military who are able to do that. And the church, on behalf of its soldiers and on behalf of the world, needs to be able to do that when necessary. And finally, and perhaps most importantly to me, I think St. Martin provides for us a window into the deep wounds of war and the double-edged sword of the kinds of love that might take us to war, and the lament and penance and forms of life that might mark out a way for us to come home. And so while I've challenged and I hopefully broadened this status quo story in a very deliberate way, I remain convinced that for soldiers and for chaplains, that I think there can be no more fitting patron than St. Martin, who we remember this day. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. And we do have a few minutes to do some questions, but especially I'll pass the mic around for those who want, but while you were thinking of questions, I'll kick us off. Your own experience, you were an ROTC program in undergrad, not planning to be a chaplain at the time, or were you planning always to be a chaplain?
Somewhat. Probably as early as my first year was thinking in that direction, yeah.
Did that change with your sense of being, let's say, deployed in Afghanistan? Did you think, yes, being a chaplain is still what I want to be doing, or would you have preferred, or did you ever have that wonder, what would it have been like if I had been not a conscripted soldier, but if you continued in the combatant role?
No, actually, yeah, I have absolutely, that experience was an affirmation that was where I was supposed to be and who I was supposed to be in that place, yeah, for sure.
Questions? I can go pass around. Elizabeth, if you mind introducing yourself as you go.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth. I'm a junior here at Alma College, And I grew up in the Mennonite tradition. So the military and church, they didn't mix when I was a kid. But growing up and hearing war stories, it's fascinating to learn about these different theories about how, Christians and chaplains interact with war and the military, and just broadening that perspective. I just have a question from your experience, because I know sometimes you hear about people that go into military service and it kind of hardens them, or maybe they came into it with faith, but they leave kind of disenchanted. But you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that there were actually individuals who didn't have a particular faith that found themselves drawn to those relics or those medallions. Is there a sense of actually coming closer to God or searching for meaning through those experiences? Or do you find that usually people are pushed away from their faith? Or could it be both?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. The no atheists in foxholes. Yeah, I met atheists in combat. So, some certainly that kind of a crisis experience draws them near to God as a source of comfort and hope. And the shattering of meaning can also occur, and it can be a time in which faith is lost or lost for a season. I certainly know. So to come back to St. Martin, and then I'll say a bit about my own story. So I wasn't able to share kind of every detail about his life, but I think in support of this suggestion, again, it's circumstantial, but of Stancliffe's suggestion that Martin himself experienced war are just the way in which we see his life unfold after that. Of course, you can see it as, okay, he's just pursuing a monastic life, or you can see it as someone deeply wounded by war, retreating from society, and having to go through an intense period of reformation as a person on the other side of war, under the close watch of a bishop who takes him under his wing, Bishop Hilary. And as he walks through penance on the other side of war, living by himself in cave, like alone outside of society, and very much in ways that are reminiscent of many veterans who come home and find it very difficult to reconnect with the world that they left behind. And then for myself, I'll say, in my own experience of faith, coming home from war, so for me, it was very much an experience of the hiddenness of God. As I, watched people die, as I had to see it again when we came home, and the difficulty of caring for people in the midst of that I found myself completely depleted and unable to, I kind of forced myself to show up at church, but in the back, not singing, not very able to connect with what was going on other than just to even show up, which it took me a while to even get there. So yeah, I think it's both. Yeah.
Other questions? Take it in a different direction.
Here at school, I'm a freshman. I'm a retiree, sorry. But I just wonder, I have a lot of questions. I was in Vietnam, so medic. And one of the, what I wonder, in St. Martin's stories might somehow relate to this, is how maturation, of a person is impacted and impacts the experience. When Space Reminiscence, we had a draft, and most of the people there were, 20 years old, probably the average age of the people
Mhm.
who were at the lower, the draftees. How do, at that age, we've all matured differently, whether you're a student or the non-students here. And I just wonder how working with the soldiers, in your experience as a chaplain, did you see a change, or did you get people who were very young, who were very profound, people who were much older, who not? And mostly, I guess, related to that is, so what happens if you have this truly traumatic experience? How do you process that? And are there age differences? And how did you deal with that? Helping people get over there. You talk about the tragedies when people come home and when they take their own life or just have suffered. So anyway, I just wonder about the age difference, which at least in my experience was very important in shaping how people were able to deal with the trauma.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that we send what we now regard as kids, right, to war. 17, 18, 19 years old, hardly fully formed as a person, just full stop, is its own set of challenges. And so actually, this is to kind of take a sidetrack here, but Mary Wollstonecraft talks about this analogy between soldiers and women of the late 18th century, having learned manners before morals, and the sense that the moral formation of women was foreclosed intentionally. They weren't given access to education and allowed to mature into persons that could make the kinds of judgments that she was seeking for women to be able to make. And she saw something similar in the formation process for soldiers, right? That it's, kind of in adolescence, it's, this foreclosure of a more fulsome moral formation process that's very much intentional in the formation of soldiers. It's like this intentional derailment of that in one view, you could say. But yeah, so the formation of soldiers at that age, and the maturity level, not to mention the sort of prior childhood experiences that soldiers bring into their military service, can often be worse than what they experienced in war, and can compound how they are able to navigate their experiences in war. And so, yeah, absolutely, all that's in play, I think. And so I think maybe even behind your question is that whether it's possible for there to be a kind of formation that prepares soldiers to better navigate experiences of war, and to come home less deeply wounded or morally bruised or something like that. Maybe. But I also know that there's ways in which you just can't prepare for certain things, and you may know that better than I even. So, good question though. I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Other questions for Adam? I'm going to do a personal one, then if we can keep going with that. We can talk all night if you want to, but I'll do this in front of you.
Okay.
So we all leave seminary. All of us who are going off, mostly to the pastorate, but some to academic. You go off then, where I'm complaining about snow in northern Michigan, you're in Afghanistan. Kind of tough for the rest of us. How do you ever balance that, especially on days like today, where you hear it all day long of, thank you for your service, but it is a strange bit of, I'll say for a lot of us, of guilt almost, saying, what makes me feel better, at least if I can buy him a cup of coffee, then I don't have to think about what he actually went through while we were there. Do you deal with that personally? You're just a better person than the rest of us, I'll say that one. So you probably are okay handling it. But I find that conversation is a challenge.
Yeah, I don't know about for me personally, like, I mean, just kind of let it roll off me. It's not something I want or need or like and enjoy, but I think the larger thing that it points to, right, is the question about the relationship between soldiers and civilians, the military and wider American society, and the real gaps that exist, both in terms of experience and in terms of accountability and responsibility, right? And so, I mean, I guess my sense is that the things that I bear witness to soldiers suffering and enduring are really wounds that cry out within the midst of their lives, but they're wounds of our body politic as a whole. And the fractures are within their souls. And it's easier to personalize those problems as theirs. Like, this is like, let's, treat you psychologically, and which there's very good and real ways in which soldiers can be helped with therapy. And I've, of course, gone to therapy myself on the other side of war, but I think there's very real ways in which that covers over what are actually political wounds, social wounds, that something like "thank you for your service" very clearly is an attempt to, I think, address that, but it's an inability or a lack of our wider society, and this is no one person's fault, but to reckon with the full weight of that responsibility. I don't know, is that a good answer?
Yeah, that's great. It's great.
Okay.
The reckoning with responsibility, and I appreciate you being, again, the reason I admire you as a friend, but you're able to ask the questions for this, and as a chaplain, I do think you have agency there. You can make those questions possible for the soldiers who are wrestling with that sense of, what am I doing here? Whose decision was it? And what's my responsibility? I appreciate having chaplains who want to do things like that. We have time for one or two more. Any other questions out there? Adam, anything you want to know about Alma College before we close out?
I want to hear more about this opera house. That story was, Andrew was telling me the story of the town and Mr. Wright, and it was fascinating.
It's incredible history. We'll walk you through the stuff.
Yeah. But yeah, happy to talk after this formally ends with whoever wants to talk about whatever.
Thank you for being here today. Thank you all for coming, and let's offer appreciation to Adam for coming up here from Duke and for offering his thoughts. Folks, there's time for mingle and greets and get to know each other, chat. Certainly come introduce yourself to Adam. Make me proud of being a college staff. Show off.